Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Tavares, and this is The Bubble, the weekly video podcast series in which we look back on the week and assess all of the major political events affecting London. As always, I'm joined by the irrepressible Roger Evans, former Deputy Mayor of London, who'll be providing lots of invaluable insight and analysis into those events and allowing us mere mortals to somehow make sense of it all and better understand how those events will impact our lives and the lives of Londoners right across the capital. Roger, good morning. Where do we start?
Good morning, Paul. Perhaps we need to start with the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday and the new lockdown that we're all facing here nationally now, as well as in London. I think we probably all knew in our hearts that it was coming along, but it's still a very depressing thing to hear. And it's going to be really tough for people to manage through the next 4 weeks, at least, because it could take longer than that. Remember, the last lockdown we had was approaching the summer months and things were fairly cheerful. This is usually a gloomy part of the year, and it's going to be even gloomier now.
Over the weekend, we saw the announcement of the Prime Minister's intention to hold a press conference on Monday, leaked to the newspapers on the Friday beforehand. Now, obviously, this drew a lot of anger and annoyance from the part of Number 10 and the Prime Minister, to the extent that the Prime Minister issued an inquiry almost immediately into the source of that leak. Naturally, this caused the Prime Minister to move the press conference ahead of schedule to Saturday. Now, when he walked out, flanked either side by Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, and Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Advisor to the government, what did you think of what they had to say in terms of the justification for the second lockdown?
Well, you know, part of me is not surprised at the leaking. When I was a politician, I used to, just assume if there were more than half a dozen of us around the table that the information we were talking about would find its way into places that we didn't want it to go, because it's in the nature of the beast that happens. I thought there was a bit of data overload in the presentations, and I was a bit surprised that they kicked off with the slides and with Chris Whitty demonstrating them, rather than with a statement from the Prime Minister first, which I think would have put things into context better. I guess it's easy to be picky, because clearly they were making changes to that presentation right up to the point that they went. They'd started with a deadline of 4 o'clock, then 5 o'clock, then 6:30, and of course, it was nearly going to run into Strictly Come Dancing, which would have been really serious. So they had to rush to put it together. And I think as well it leaves questions unanswered, which we're only seeing the answers to in the political interviews today, and probably as the week commences. I noticed Keir Starmer's called for the lockdown to start immediately. I think that's a bit impractical. People in Westminster sometimes don't understand that those of us outside, whether as individuals or families or businesses, or in fact the public services, do need time to prepare for this. And it's good that we've got those 4 days to get our things in order before we have to grit our teeth and go through another month of this.
Well, the WHO have publicly stated that they don't advocate lockdowns as a primary means of controlling the virus. In fact, if anything, it causes far greater harm than benefits. This is what David Nabarro, the UK envoy to WHO, had to say just a few short weeks ago.
By Professor Gupta, I want to say it again. We in the World Health Organization do not advocate lockdowns as a primary means of control of this virus. The only time we believe a lockdown is justified is to buy you time to reorganize, regroup, rebalance your resources, protect your health workers who are exhausted. But by and large, we'd rather not do it. Just look at what's happened to the tourism industry, for example, in the Caribbean or in the Pacific, because people aren't taking their holidays. Look what's happened to smallholder farmers all over the world, because their markets have got dented. look what's happening to poverty levels. It seems that we may well have a doubling of world poverty by next year. We may well have at least a doubling of child malnutrition because children are not getting meals at school and their parents in poor families are not able to afford it. This is a terrible, ghastly global catastrophe, actually. And so we really do appeal to all world leaders. Stop using lockdown as your primary control method. Develop better systems for doing it. Work together and learn from each other. But remember, lockdowns just have one consequence that you must never, ever belittle, and that is making poor people an awful lot poorer.
If you look specifically at London, the capital's hospitals have 21,000 beds available, and yet only 8% of those beds are allocated to what is classified as COVID patients. So given that, and the invariable impact that a second lockdown is going to have in terms of public health, mortality rates for non-COVID related illnesses and diseases, in terms of the impact on businesses, jobs, and the economy, we know that that impact will be far greater this time around than when we had the first lockdown. So given that to be the case, do you think that the decision to move into lockdown on this occasion was the right one?
I think it's a very tough decision, and you make a good point there that lockdown has casualties as well, whether it's all of the NHS patients who are trying to use the service for other life-saving interventions who can't get access and who may die as a result, whether it's the people who lose their businesses or their jobs who may be driven to desperate measures as well. So there is a downside here, and part of the problem, of course, is that that's not considered in amongst the scientific graphs which are looking at the current state of spread and growth of the disease in the population. So politicians have got a really tough decision to make about which way they jump. I think they've got to be clear about the reason for lockdown. The reason for the first lockdown, and as I understand it for this one, is to make sure that the NHS doesn't get overwhelmed. Part of the problem with COVID, of course, is that it's got such a long lead-in time. You catch it days, weeks before you actually start to see the symptoms, and then things get worse. So it's very difficult to predict what the growth will be like, and we know it can be exponential. So, but from a point of view of protecting NHS capacity, I have some sympathy with them. We don't want to see scenes like the ones we saw in Italy and China at the start of this, where we had hospitals overcrowded and people lying on trolleys and even on the floor. Unfortunately, some people seem to think that lockdown is going to be a magic wand. It's going to prevent infection, and there are some people who are now saying that we should never have come out of lockdown and we should have stayed in it. You know, just imagine the dreadful effects that would have had, not just on the nation's economy, but on people's collective psychology as well, if they'd been locked away from contact with society for that length of time. So it needs to be specifically targeted at maintaining those NHS resources that we need. And it needs to be stopped as soon as possible. And people shouldn't be misled into thinking that this is a long-term solution. It's a short-term fix to ensure we've got the beds to treat people. The long-term solution is going to be more natural immunity within the population, hopefully a vaccine which is going to work and will help to build up that natural immunity. But that's the only way out of this in the end.
One of the things that struck me when I was watching it myself was when Chris Whitty was presenting all of those charts, and it seemed to me from what he said very clearly that this decision was really driven by forecasting models and surveys from the ONS. The thought that a major political decision is being run on forecast models that have been proven to be highly and grossly inaccurate and a survey or a number of surveys is a little worrying, given the impact that this lockdown is going to have. So do you think that we're on the right trajectory at the moment, given the fact that the basis for that argument seems to be quite shaky?
Well, you're asking me to second guess the modelling, which is a bit difficult. There's a saying which has been around for ages with computers, of course, which is garbage in, garbage out. And if you set up a model which has the wrong assumptions or you feed the wrong data into it, then you're going to get something out of it which isn't correct either. And I think there are such a lot of different varying factors here that it's difficult to construct a model that's 100% accurate. One of the questions I always used to ask when I was presented with data at City Hall was whether it was actual scientific data that had been gathered or whether it had been modeled. And so often actually you find that what's presented as gathered data is in fact extrapolated using a computer model. And you can ask a lot of questions about the veracity of that model in all sorts of situations. This one is particularly difficult, of course, because we don't have a lot of information to feed in. So there's going to be a degree of guesswork, if you like, and different models are showing us very different things. The only silver lining in that particular cloud is that as we become more familiar with COVID and as time progresses, the models should become more accurate. The models we're using now actually should be more accurate than the ones that they were using back in March. And certainly I think the Imperial College one, which was badly discredited, is not a model that they're relying on anymore.
Well, thank goodness for that. I suppose my question to you now is that obviously the pressure on the NHS is very much at the forefront of the decision that was taken yesterday and that was announced yesterday. But then does that beg the question that either A, the government didn't do enough preparatory work in order to mitigate those challenges since summer, or does it mean that actually the NHS itself, in terms of how we structure it and how it operates, needs to be reevaluated seriously?
Well, I think it's always worth looking at what the NHS does and how it works and considering ways that we could improve it. There's a little bit too much worshipping going on around the NHS rather than actually asking cold hard questions about what works and what doesn't work. And you have to ask those sort of questions if an institution is to progress and to improve. One of the things we've seen, of course, throughout Europe is that many other countries have lockdowns for the same purpose as well, yet they have different health delivery models. So it may not just be the NHS's model that's having difficulties here. Clearly other people are. One of the things that we should be able to do is look at other countries and learn from their experiences. And I'd also caution against comparing the data that we have now with the data that we had during the lockdown months ago, because of course we've learned a lot about how to treat this disease and what works and what doesn't. And because procedures are changing in hospitals, I'd be very surprised if admissions procedures weren't changing as well. So to compare the two figures with each other without actually understanding the way that the data is affected by things other than the spread of the disease is to be avoided, really.
Well, listen, moving on from lockdown for a moment, this is something I'm sure we could talk about all day, quite frankly. But moving on to the next subject, the one thing that I also wanted to talk about, which I think was the other, I suppose, big political event of the week, was the report from the EHRC, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, on institutional anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. It was an incredibly damning report, wasn't it?
It was, and I was very pleased to see that Keir Starmer took the opportunity to apologise for what had happened, because clearly a lot of people were hurt. A lot of people were frightened. I have friends in the Jewish community in London who were actually talking about leaving the country if Labour won power, which is a pretty shocking thing to be said about any major party, really. And there were people, good members of parliament like Louise Ellman, who were driven out of the Labour Party. So they clearly had something to apologise for and something to put right. And I'm also pleased to see that Keir Starmer has agreed to implement all of the recommendations in the report, because genuine contrition is only partly about expressing an apology. It's also about saying what you're going to do to prevent the same situation arising again in future. And I think they've made a good start, but they've got a lot of mess to clean up.
Absolutely. Just to put it into context for those watching at home, the Human Rights Commission have only ever once before investigated a political party for institutional racism, that being the British Nationalist Party, the BNP. So the very fact that the weight of evidence in advance of the investigation was so great that it even merited an investigation in the first place into the Labour Party, a mainstream political party, is a huge, huge deal. Absolutely huge. Now, insofar as the report's findings were concerned, the report found that there was a culture accepting of anti-Semitism, and that there was a real failure of the leadership in terms of dealing with that at all. The report also states that there were unlawful acts of harassment and discrimination. And then in its final conclusion, the investigation found that there was political interference into the complaints process, and that in total there were 23 incidences of inappropriate interference from the office of the opposition leader. So with that in mind, do you think those responsible will be adequately dealt with by Sir Keir Starmer?
I think they probably will. One of the, I've been in London politics for almost 30 years. So I've had a lot of opportunity to work with Labour Party members, and I met a lot of people there who are genuinely good people. We may disagree about our politics, but they want to do good for the community. So this extreme element that came to power within the party is not, it's not impossible to defeat it and to remove it. And one of the things we notice about political leaders who change their parties is that they're not scared to do this. If you look at Tony Blair, for instance, he actually removed quite a lot of people from the Labour Party who were on the extremes. If you look at David Cameron, when he came in as Conservative Party leader, he was very uncompromising with people who he felt were saying things, expressing values that the party didn't have. They were thrown out. And leaders like that, when they see someone in the party saying something that they don't want to be associated with, they don't treat it as a problem. They treat it as an opportunity to throw that person out of the door and demonstrate that they're in control of their party. And what did we see almost straight away? Jeremy Corbyn suspended for saying that elements of the report had been overblown or exaggerated by Labour's enemies, and for not taking it seriously. So clearly Starmer has started as he means to go on, and he's taken on the biggest target he could find there, and there may well be a period of civil war within the Labour Party. And I hope that Starmer is victorious, because next time there's an election, the country deserves to have a choice between political parties without actually having to consider things like anti-Semitism, which shouldn't be a problem in the case of any major party putting itself up for election.
You just rightly mentioned that the possibility of a civil war within the Labour Party. We even had Len McCluskey coming out and warning of chaos in Labour if Jeremy Corbyn wasn't reinstated to the party. And we've seen a number of the former shadow cabinets also take part in an online campaign to get him reinstated. Do you think that there is a real risk now, unless Sir Keir Starmer manages this process carefully and delicately, that we could actually see a split in the Labour Party?
Well, Keir has got to manage it delicately, and he was involved. Really, the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn happened at arm's length. It wasn't something that he was going to get involved with personally. In fact, he told one interviewer that he deliberately didn't ring Jeremy Corbyn up personally to tell him, because he wanted to be different from the last leadership and not to involve himself in the disciplinary process, which I think is right. During the Blair years, there were quite a lot of trade unions that actually withdrew funding from the Labour Party. They weren't as big as Len McCluskey's outfit, but a lot of the smaller unions did. The RMT, for instance, didn't fund Labour for many years. So to some extent, they can do without Labour funding and without union funding. And I think that Starmer and the new Labour people will be quite pleased to see the back of a lot of the extremists, actually, if they decide to break away and form a new party. Because, all right, in the longer run, Labour will have fewer activists, but they will have more voters. And in the end, it's the voters that determine whether you're actually going to get into government. I mean, during the election in 2019, I was doing some campaigning in a very marginal seat in North London. And we were a bit thin on the ground, and I was surprised to see the Labour Party were going around in sort of groups 7 or 8 strong. They had so many people, they didn't really know what to do with them all. And it looked pretty grim, but actually we held that seat very comfortably. And I think to some extent the zealotry of some of those people on the doorstep probably actually made people vote the other way. So some people, I think the Labour Party can do without.
You mentioned earlier about how Keir Starmer held a press conference and rightly said that it was unacceptable. His party apologized for all of this. But do you think that he himself has a lot of questions to answer for? Because Michael Gove actually took to social media, and he rightly said that whilst all of this was going on, Sir Keir Starmer sat in the shadow cabinet. He was, if you like, within the centre of all of this whilst it was going on, and yet he remained silent at the time. It's only now that he is leader that he is now coming out and speaking out against it. So do you think he actually has a lot to answer for himself, for his own actions or rather inactions?
Well, he could have resigned from the cabinet, the shadow cabinet, over anti-Semitism. He could have returned to their backbenches, as many people did, of course, because there were mass rolling resignations from the shadow cabinet on a couple of occasions. He chose to stay there and stick it out. So obviously, there's an argument that he shouldn't have done. I suspect his response will be that he was a moderating influence around the table with those people, and perhaps it would be better to have him sitting there than another Corbynite elevated and put into that seat. I think it's not just Sir Keir, of course. There are quite a lot of people who have questions to answer who nominated Jeremy Corbyn to be leader of the Labour Party in the first place, including Sadiq Khan, of course, who was one of the nominees. I think there were about 30 of them, and there are some quite surprising names on that list. Clearly people who thought that they were happy to sign off on Corbyn without ever considering the possibility that he might come to power.
You just mentioned Sadiq Khan, which offers up the perfect segue into the next segment, which is called In the Spotlight, in which we assess a political figure in London politics. And today, obviously, we have Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. In light of your vast experience at City Hall, and from what you have observed from a distance, what do you think of Sadiq Khan's performance in the role of Mayor of London, and how does he compare to previous mayors?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? When the Mayor of London was created by Blair, he was clearly looking for someone who could speak for the city, but also for someone who was managerially competent. And what he got instead, of course, was a sort of nostalgia mayor, which was the return of Ken Livingstone to run the capital. Actually, Ken was he was very good on detail, and whilst I didn't agree with him on quite a lot of what he did, he was a good administrator, and he was good at negotiating with government. He had a lot of strengths, Ken. But it didn't tell us much more about the sort of person that should be occupying the Mayor of London's job, because it was a sort of throwback to the old GLC days. Then we had Boris, who was a very different, a celebrity mayor. Boris, the people at City Hall did things for Boris because they wanted to, and because he motivated them to do things, rather than Ken, who was all about power and fear to some extent. So Boris was a very different sort of person, but again, he didn't tell us much about the sort of person who should be in that job permanently, because Boris was a bit of an exception. When I saw Sadiq elected, I felt that he was probably more the sort of person that Blair had in mind, basically a managerialist who had a London background. I've watched him with interest for 4 years. He struggled quite a lot to get into the job at first. I think managerially, I used to say it was like watching David Brent without the humour at Mayor's Question Time, and he had a sort of cornered approach to Question Time, whereas Boris and Ken would always come out swinging and making extravagant statements. Sadiq would be much more defensive than they were, and wouldn't say much, wouldn't create many hostages to fortune. And it wasn't particularly interesting, but you don't necessarily want government to be interesting. You want it to be effective. And I think he's grown into the role in the last 4 years. I think that he's become more comfortable with the role. I think he still grandstands a bit too much. There isn't really a passing bandwagon that can go through London without him jumping on it, particularly if it's a left-wing cause. And I think there is, on the one hand, it's a good thing to see someone who is prepared to take on the government and fight for more for London, which is what he was doing over the TfL settlement. And in fact, we had earlier this morning the announcement that the settlement has been agreed, and Sadiq has basically said he's got everything he wanted, and the government have also said that. That tends to mean that people will have made concessions on both sides. But the problem with blaming the government for everything that goes wrong, which appears to be his approach, is that if you're not careful, you actually set a trend for the organisation that you run. And I've seen this back in the 90s when we had Conservative government over a lengthy period of time. There were Labour authorities in London where everything that went wrong was blamed on the lack of government funding. And that meant that eventually the people in charge, both at council level and at administrative level, were people who were more accustomed to blaming the government for things that went wrong than for taking responsibility for them. And eventually the worst thing happened for those authorities, which was that a Labour government was elected and gave them the money that they needed. And they still couldn't deliver the services because they didn't actually have that experience anymore. They created a culture of failure and buck passing. And it took a long time to actually put that right. So Sadiq needs to be careful that he doesn't create a similar culture to that at City Hall. Not least because, of course, we may see a time under Starmer when Labour are in power again, and they give him what he wants, and he struggles to deliver it. So although he needs to make a strong case to government, he needs to retain the capacity to actually deliver services locally rather than just make excuses for the failures of them. And something else which I think he needs to do a bit more of is really developing a unique brand for London, a unique set of requests for powers that he may want from government, for things that he may want to do to improve the city. You know, I've said for a long time that I think that we should be moving away from saying that London should be bigger to concentrating on making it better rather than bigger for the people who live here. And perhaps that means building better relationships with other cities around the UK. You know, we're twinned with a number of cities around the world, but what's our relationship like with Manchester or Birmingham or Leeds? Probably it should be closer and better than it is. And probably we should share some of our good fortune with those cities, because not only will it help them, it will actually alleviate some of the problems that we have ourselves with congestion and air quality and unrealistic property prices.
The Mayor of London is responsible for a number of key policy areas, such as policing and crime, housing, public transport. So how would you evaluate Sadiq Khan's track record so far in those key areas of policy and his ability to deliver the results that London needs?
On housing, he's failed his targets. He's not delivered the amount of residential property that was needed or foreseen. And yet we've seen there's been a considerable amount of construction around, and I just question how much more London can actually take of more and more people being brought in to use the limited services here. On policing, I think the elephant in the room has been knife crime, which has seen some real problems. During Boris's tenure, we actually managed to get knife crime down. It was a struggle because it's an approach which requires, it's a problem that requires an approach across several different institutions across the whole of society rather than just policing. But it has drifted back up again under Sadiq's watch. Of course, COVID has largely thrown a veil over his performance on all of these things because it's changed the city so much. And when he faces election next year, then I think COVID will mean that he will have a ready-made response to any shortcomings that are raised by people. On transport, I was actually quite surprised that they managed to maintain the fare freeze for as long as they did. We were always told by Transport for London that they needed every penny that they could get. And I thought that the fares freeze would be easily done for a year because Transport for London had a good operating surplus year on year. I thought it would be a struggle the second year. I thought they'd probably have to put fares up in the third year to avoid having to do it in the fourth year just before the mayoral election. It didn't happen, and that suggests to me actually that the amount of fat in TfL was a good deal higher than they were prepared to admit to us in the past, and the number of savings was actually more achievable. But how long that can go on is a question, of course. And I understand the government have asked for more savings from TfL as a part of their package. So it will be interesting to see where he goes to find that money.
Well, what's interesting is that even though in those policy areas his track record is not the greatest, shall we say, and yet he seems to be flying high in opinion polls, and the latest poll puts him at 48, with Sean Bailey, the Conservative candidate, at 28%. How do you explain his popularity, given the fact that his performance, his effectiveness as Mayor of London has been so poor?
Well, there are two big drivers of the London vote in the long term. One of those is demographic change. As the city becomes more diverse, so it tends to lean towards voting Labour. That's because people who come to London as new immigrants are involved with unionised activities, with community activities, the sort of things which get you to vote Labour. Now, that's something which may change beyond the first generation when people get established and start to become more middle class and look at different political choices. But their first instinct when they arrive tends to be to go down the Labour route. The other driver is, of course, who is in government, because one of the things about London is it always seems to vote in local elections against the party that's in power nationally. It's interesting, actually, that we have a capital city that's culturally out of step with the rest of the country in that way, but it has always been the case. So, ironically for Sadiq, having a conservative government is actually a big help towards his chances of re-election, because he doesn't have to carry the protest vote in the way that Ken Livingstone had to when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. But there are also other features. There are a lot of students in London who tend to be Labour voters now. Brexit is a driving factor, as we've seen. It helped to regenerate the Liberal Democrat vote in London, which had gone through the floor, but post-Brexit, a lot of Remainers drifted back to the Lib Dems. The Lib Dem candidate probably won't be a threat to Sadiq, because he's been very Remainy in his approach. He's nailed his flag to that mast. You might remember the New Year's Eve fireworks a couple of years ago, where he lit the wheel up as a Euro flag. So pro-Remainers, pro-Europeans in London who would maybe vote for the Liberal Democrats might vote for Sadiq instead. They might give him their second vote. And of course, the two-stage vote system actually does tend to mitigate in favour of one of the major parties, because in the first round, the smaller parties go out and their votes transfer to the big candidates. So it's probably not looking great for a Conservative victory in May.
Well, given the polling data, it would definitely suggest that. So they certainly have a huge mountain to climb if they want to make any or pose any kind of real challenge to Sadiq Khan. But
well, Sean Bailey, the candidate, Sean Bailey's got a real energy, and he's rushing around doing lots of campaigning, being seen all over the place. But London is a big city, millions of people, lots of ground to cover. It's questionable whether even the drive of one person can cover that sort of ground in time for the election. And COVID doesn't help, because everyone ends up locked down, so the number of opportunities to meet people is smaller.
Absolutely. London, without doubt, is going through tremendous turmoil. And do you think that Sadiq Khan is an individual that possesses the leadership qualities and the vision needed in order to give us Londoners hope for the future and a path towards transitioning out of this catastrophic disaster that we now currently find ourselves in the midst of?
Well, I honestly don't see much in the way of big vision in Sadiq's approach to managing the city, and in that respect, he's a different sort of mayor to his two predecessors, who were both people with big vision, whether you agreed with what they were doing or not. Sadiq's unique contribution really doesn't seem to have gone any further than water fountains, which we've got around London. He has done some good work on air quality, and there's some very impressive reduction in nitrogen dioxide figures around London that was announced recently. But at the same time, we saw that other types of pollutants from vehicles, particulates, PM10s, hadn't gone down. So that makes me wonder how they actually achieved a reduction in one type of pollution from vehicles, but not others. There are, no doubt, as we talked about computer modeling before, there will be things at play which need to be unpacked within that statement to see exactly what's happened. But there has been an improvement, and it's not all been down to just the fact we've had COVID, so no one's traveling around anymore. But I don't see a bigger vision, and I think there's a real opportunity here actually for a mayoral candidate who could arrive on the scene and talk about how they saw London in, say, 10 or 20 years' time. Because to be honest, I don't see that from any of the mayoral candidates at the moment. It's one of the more depressing things about the campaign. We really need to have a positive vision of what the city will be like in future. Can the city survive as it is with more working from home, which is going to be a feature of the coming decades. What are our relationships going to be like as an international city with other countries? Where are we going to build those relationships? How are we going to use technology to work to improve the city? How are we going to diversify the economic sectors of the city so that it's more resilient than the single finance model that we had back in the last decade? There are a lot of big questions out there looking for answers, and there's room in the debate, I think, for someone who's willing to talk about that.
And now on to our final point of discussion, Hammersmith Bridge. A recent report found that the bridge had in excess of 20 years worth of unchecked corrosion. The bridge is now expected to remain closed until 2027 to all vehicles, although an interim solution involving a ferry service has been touted and is expected to potentially be up and running sometime in the spring of next year. The closure to Hammersmith Bridge has greatly impacted both local residents and businesses alike. So my question to you is, given the strategic importance of Hammersmith Bridge to London's public transport infrastructure, how have things been allowed to deteriorate on the bridge to this extent?
I think we know it's an important bridge, not least because the IRA have tried to blow it up on no fewer than 3 occasions. So it's clearly something which is going to harm London if we don't have it. It's an essential piece of infrastructure. And there was a very interesting meeting earlier this week between the leaders of Hammersmith and Fulham Council on the North Bank, who own the bridge, and the leader of Richmond Council on the South Bank, and the government minister and Transport for London. And it was all done. It was a public meeting done online, so you could tune in and watch what they were saying. And that's where a lot of these figures came from. So they were saying it's going to cost over £100 million to reinstate the bridge for traffic. It's going to take 6.5 years before they can have vehicles crossing the bridge. Again, although of course they can do it, they can reinstate the bridge for pedestrians and cyclists rather sooner than that. But as to how it's come to this state, the closure of the bridge for major work is nothing new for those of us who've been around for a while. Back in the late 90s, the bridge was closed for an extended period of time for structural work. And again, it was closed in 2014 for work as well. And I'm a bit surprised actually in 2014 that they didn't spot the problems which they're talking about now, because they're talking about having had decades of corrosion. You'd have thought that when they did the work 6 years ago, they would have been able to see the progress, and maybe it wouldn't have been the big surprise that it seems suddenly to have been. So I think Hammersmith and Fulham Council, who own the bridge, have got some questions to answer about their stewardship of it there, really. Apparently the problem is in the main pillars that support the bridge, so it's pretty serious. It's cracking of the metal. It's so serious that they won't even allow boats to travel underneath the bridge except in convoy in case bits fall off and hit them. So they're saying they need 4 months to actually survey it and understand the work that needs to be done, and then probably a 1.5 years before they can actually make the structure safe. And then after that, they have to do other work to make it capable of carrying vehicles and buses, of course. This isn't just about private cars, it's about buses, emergency services, delivery vehicles as well. The government minister, Charlotte Veer, has said that the government will make a contribution to supporting this work because the bridge is a strategic asset which has national implications. But she was reluctant to just give them all the money in one go, because I think she fears that the work will progress perhaps as far as the cycling and walking stage, and then TfL and the council will say, oh, we don't have any money to open it to cars, which after all, reducing the number of cars in the city is a long-term objective of local government here. So we need to make sure that the bridge is actually reopened in its entirety, but it looks like it's going to take a long time to do it.
It seems to me that the biggest issue at the moment concerning Hammersmith Bridge is who's going to pay for the repairs. At the moment, you have a three-way tug-of-war between Hammersmith and Fulham Council, who have a legal responsibility for maintaining the bridge, Transport for London, and the government. So who do you think is ultimately going to pay for this?
Various councils along the river have responsibility for their bridges, and it's noticeable, by the way, that none of the others have the same problems that Hammersmith Council have with theirs. So it's perhaps worth them considering their stewardship, particularly as in 2016 they were saying that the bridge was sound and was not having any of the problems that we now discover were there. The problem, of course, is that it's a huge amount of money for a London local authority to raise. Even if they raise the council tax, they wouldn't be able to get it all. So Transport for London will have to make a contribution, and the government have recognised that they need to make a contribution to this as well, because it's not just a problem for Hammersmith Council. Actually, if you look at the disruption to traffic, the disruption to services, it's actually affecting the whole of West London. So, so naturally there will be a need for other people to stump up money, and I think there's a willingness to do it because it needs to be sorted.
Hammersmith and Fulham Council are currently facing huge budgetary pressures, which kind of explains why they've taken the position that due to the Hammersmith Bridge's strategic importance to London's transport, that in fact it shouldn't be them who pays for the repairs, but rather the government. Now, obviously, whilst it is impossible to envisage the local council not paying anything towards the project, do you think that the government and TfL are going to have to compromise hugely in order to ensure that the works are carried out and completed as soon as possible?
I think there will be a compromise. The over £100 million is a large amount of money for a borough to find, even a big London borough. And the alternative to raising it, of course, is borrowing it, and that's a possibility that they could look at. But again, it will affect the council's credit rating quite possibly and make it more expensive to service any other debt that they have as well. So although ideally the council would make a large contribution as it's their responsibility, the practical reality, a bit like with the TfL fares argument, is that this is one of those too big to fail things which the government are probably going to have to step in and bail out. But at the end of the day, of course, because so much of the tax which the government gets is raised in London anyway, it just means that Londoners will end up paying a large amount towards it via a different route.
Roger, sadly, we've come to the end of yet another show. Thank you so much for your time and your insights, as always. To you at home, I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, be sure to click on the like button down below and on the subscribe button in order to receive alerts every time we upload a new video. In the meantime, be sure to help us spread the word in order to successfully grow the channel. In the meantime, take care, and we'll hopefully see you again very soon.